It was a Sunday evening in August, the kind of muggy Washington night when most Americans were thinking about the end of summer vacation and the beginning of the school year. At 9 p.m. Eastern Time, television sets across the nation flickered on for a special address. President Richard Nixon sat behind his desk in the Oval Office, looking directly into the camera with that forced smile he wore when he was about to drop a bombshell. He spoke for 15 minutes. He talked about jobs, about inflation, about foreign speculators attacking the dollar. And then, almost casually, buried in the middle of a list of economic measures, he announced that the United States was suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Most viewers didn't understand what they had just heard. It sounded like technical financial jargon, the kind of policy adjustment that economists worry about, but that doesn't affect ordinary people. The stock market, however, understood perfectly. On Monday morning, August 16th, 1971, traders on Wall Street went berserk. The Dow Jones Industrial Average surged by over 32 points, one of the largest single-day gains in history at the time. It wasn't a panic, it was a celebration. The shackles were off. America could now print as much money as it wanted without worrying about a run on Fort Knox. But in the finance ministries of Europe and Japan, the reaction was horror. The world had just been told that the anchor of the global monetary system, the one fixed point that everyone had relied on since the end of World War II, had been cut loose. The dollar, which was supposed to be as good as gold, was now just a piece of paper backed by nothing but the promise of a government that had just broken its promise. Nixon called it a temporary measure. He said it was necessary to protect American workers from foreign speculators. He promised it would be brief. That was 53 years ago. The suspension has never been lifted. And the world Nixon created that Sunday night, a world of floating currencies, endless deficits, and permanent inflation, is the world we still live in today. To understand why Nixon made this decision and why it was one of the most consequential acts of economic vandalism in modern history, you have to go back to a hotel in New Hampshire in 1944. World War II was still raging, but the Allied powers were already planning for the peace. At the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, representatives of 44 nations gathered to design a new global financial system. The memory of the 1930s was fresh. The Great Depression had been made worse by competitive devaluations, where countries raced to cheapen their currencies to boost exports, creating a downward spiral of economic warfare. The architects of Bretton Woods wanted to prevent that from ever happening again. The system they designed was elegant in its simplicity. Gold would remain the ultimate store of value. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other major currency would be pegged to the dollar. If a French businessman wanted to trade francs for dollars, he could. If a central bank wanted to trade dollars for gold, the United States Treasury promised to honor that exchange. It was a pyramid with gold at the top, the dollar in the middle, and every other currency anchored to the dollar. This system worked brilliantly for the United States in the immediate post-war years. America emerged from World War II holding more than two-thirds of the world's monetary gold. Fort Knox was overflowing. The U.S. economy was the only major industrial power that hadn't been bombed into rubble. American factories were producing half of the world's manufactured goods. The dollar was not just as good as gold, it was better than gold because you could earn interest on dollars. The world was happy to hold dollars. They needed dollars to buy American machinery, American wheat, and American oil. But the system contained a fatal flaw, a design defect that would eventually tear it apart. The problem was known as the Triffin dilemma, named after the economist Robert Triffin, who predicted the collapse as early as 1959. The dilemma was simple. For the global economy to grow, the world needed more dollars in circulation to facilitate trade. But for the world to have more dollars, the United States had to run deficits. It had to send more dollars abroad than it took in. This meant that over time, the number of dollars circulating in the world would grow larger and larger, while the amount of gold sitting in Fort Knox stayed fixed. Eventually, the claims on gold would exceed the gold itself. At that point, anyone who did the math would realize that the promise was impossible to keep. For the first 15 years after Bretton Woods, this wasn't a problem. American deficits were modest. Foreign countries were rebuilding and happy to accumulate dollars. But in the 1960s, the math started to break down. The United States was fighting a war in Vietnam that was costing billions of dollars a year. President Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society, a massive expansion of domestic spending on healthcare, education, and welfare. Johnson wanted both guns and butter. He wanted to fight communism in Southeast Asia and poverty at home. But he didn't want to raise taxes to pay for either because raising taxes would be politically unpopular. So the government did what governments always do when they don't want to make hard choices. They printed money. Not literally, but effectively. The Federal Reserve expanded the money supply. The Treasury ran larger and larger deficits. Dollars flooded out of the United States into the global economy. By the late 1960s, there were more dollars held by foreigners than there was gold in Fort Knox to back them up. The pyramid had become inverted. Smart people noticed, and the smartest, most cynical person who noticed was Charles de Gaulle, the president of France. De Gaulle despised the Bretton Woods system. He saw it for what it was, a mechanism that allowed America to live beyond its means by forcing the rest of the world to accept paper dollars in exchange for real goods. In a famous press conference in 1965, de Gaulle declared that France would no longer play this game. He announced that France would begin converting its dollar reserves into gold. He sent the French Navy to New York Harbor to pick up the gold bars and transport them back to the Banque de France. This was not just an economic decision. It was a geopolitical middle finger. De Gaulle was saying that France would not subsidize American wars and American consumption. He was calling America's bluff, and other countries started to follow. Switzerland, Germany, and Japan all began quietly exchanging dollars for gold. The gold was flowing out of Fort Knox at an alarming rate. In 1959, the United States held over 20,000 tons of gold. By 1971, that number had fallen to around 8,000 tons. At the rate it was being drained, the vaults would be empty within a few years. By the time Richard Nixon took office in 1969, the situation was approaching a crisis. The Vietnam War was still raging. Inflation was accelerating. The trade balance had turned negative for the first time in the 20th century. Foreign countries were exporting more to America than they were importing. The dollars were piling up in foreign central banks, and those central banks were getting nervous. They could see the math. They knew the gold was running out. They started to suspect that the United States might not honor its commitment. Nixon's economic advisors were terrified. They warned him that a run on the dollar was imminent. If a major country, say Germany or Japan, decided to dump all of its dollars and demand gold, it would trigger a panic. Other countries would rush to do the same. The United States would be forced to either default on its gold obligations or close the gold window and devalue the dollar. Either option would be a humiliation. It would shatter the credibility of American financial power. But Nixon had a more immediate problem. He was facing re-election in 1972. The economy was sluggish. Unemployment was rising. The stock market was stagnant. His advisors told him that unless the economy improved, he would lose. Nixon was not a man who accepted losing. He was also not a man who understood or cared much about the theoretical elegance of international monetary systems. He cared about winning elections, and to win, he needed to goose the economy. The problem was that the Bretton Woods system limited what he could do. If he wanted to stimulate the economy by cutting interest rates and increasing government spending, the Federal Reserve would have to create more dollars. But creating more dollars would make foreign central banks even more nervous. They would accelerate their conversion of dollars into gold. The gold drain would get worse. The system was a straitjacket. In the summer of 1971, the crisis came to a head. The British ambassador walked into the U.S. Treasury and presented a formal request. Britain wanted to convert $3 billion into gold. It was a polite request, but the implication was clear. Britain, America's closest ally, no longer trusted the dollar. If Britain pulled the trigger, everyone else would follow. The run would begin. Nixon called an emergency meeting. He gathered his top economic advisors at Camp David, the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains. The meeting took place over the weekend of August 13th to 15th, 1971. It was a small group. Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Budget Director George Shultz, and a few others. They debated for hours. Arthur Burns, the cautious academic, argued for trying to preserve the system. He warned that closing the gold window would destroy the international monetary order and trigger a crisis of confidence. He said it would be seen as a default, an admission that America could not keep its promises. John Connally, the swaggering Texan who served as Treasury Secretary, disagreed. He told Nixon that the gold window was a trap. He said that defending it meant accepting permanent constraints on American policy. He argued that the United States should not allow a bunch of European bankers to dictate what America could and could not do. His advice was simple: cut the cord. Let the dollar float. If foreign countries didn't like it, too bad. America held all the leverage. The world needed dollars more than America needed gold. Nixon listened to both sides, but in his gut, he agreed with Connally. Nixon was a political animal. He understood power. And he understood that the real power in 1971 was not gold sitting in a vault. It was the fact that the entire world economy ran on dollars. Every barrel of oil, every container ship, every international loan was denominated in dollars. If foreign countries stopped accepting dollars, their own economies would collapse. They had no choice but to keep playing the game, even if America changed the rules. On Sunday night, Nixon went on television and announced the decision. He framed it as a defense of American workers against foreign speculators. He blamed other countries for taking advantage of the United States. He promised that the suspension of gold convertibility was temporary, just until the system could be renegotiated on fairer terms. It was a masterpiece of political spin. He made it sound like America was the victim, not the defaulter. The immediate reaction was chaos. Currency markets around the world went haywire. The major currencies that had been pegged to the dollar were suddenly floating. No one knew what anything was worth. Central banks tried to intervene, buying and selling currencies to stabilize the markets, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. Within weeks, most major currencies had appreciated significantly against the dollar. The German mark rose by 10%, the Japanese yen rose by 17%. The dollar had effectively been devalued, which was exactly what Nixon wanted. A cheaper dollar meant American exports would be more competitive and foreign imports would be more expensive. It was a short-term stimulus for the American economy, but the long-term consequences were catastrophic. The collapse of Bretton Woods removed the last restraint on government spending. Before 1971, there was a discipline built into the system. If a government printed too much money, it would lose gold. The gold outflow was a signal, a warning that the economy was out of balance. After 1971, that signal was gone. Governments could print as much money as they wanted without any immediate penalty. The only constraint was the willingness of people to hold the currency. And as long as central banks and international institutions kept accepting dollars, there was no limit. The result was the great inflation of the 1970s. Prices spiraled out of control. In the United States, the inflation rate, which had been around 2% in the 1960s, soared to double digits. By 1980, inflation hit 13.5%. Savings were wiped out. Workers demanded higher wages to keep up with rising prices. Businesses raised prices to cover higher costs. It was a vicious cycle. The Federal Reserve, which had been complicit in creating the inflation, eventually had to strangle it with brutal interest rate hikes in the early 1980s. Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman, raised rates to 20%, triggering a deep recession. Millions of people lost their jobs. But it was the only way to kill the inflation monster that Nixon had unleashed. The inflation crisis of the 1970s destroyed trust in government and in institutions. It was one of the reasons for the conservative political revolution that brought Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to power. People stopped believing that governments could manage the economy. They stopped trusting experts. The social contract was broken. And it was broken because Nixon chose to prioritize his own reelection over the stability of the global financial system. But the damage went far beyond inflation. The end of Bretton Woods fundamentally changed the nature of money. Before 1971, money was a claim on something real. A dollar was a promise to deliver gold. After 1971, money became purely abstract. It was worth something only because the government said it was worth something and because people agreed to accept it. This opened the door to an entirely new kind of economy, one based on debt and speculation rather than production and savings. Without the anchor of gold, governments and central banks could create unlimited amounts of currency. This allowed the explosion of government debt that defines the modern era. In 1971, the U.S. federal debt was around $400 billion. Today, it is over $34 trillion. That increase would have been impossible under the gold standard. The markets would have revolted long before the debt reached such absurd levels. But in a fiat currency system, the debt can grow indefinitely as long as someone is willing to buy the bonds. And who buys the bonds? Central banks, which can create the money to buy them. It is a circular system, a perpetual motion machine of debt creation. The Nixon shock also turbocharged the financial sector. Before 1971, banking was a boring business. You took deposits and made loans. But in a world of floating currencies and unlimited money creation, banking became a game of leverage and speculation. The explosion of derivatives, hedge funds, private equity, and all the exotic financial instruments that would later cause the 2008 crisis can be traced back to the post-1971 world. When money is no longer tied to anything real, finance becomes detached from the real economy. It becomes a casino where the house always wins because the house can print more chips. Perhaps the most ironic consequence of Nixon's decision was the rise of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. The entire premise of Bitcoin is that it is a return to sound money, a digital form of gold that cannot be inflated by governments. Satoshi Nakamoto, the mysterious creator of Bitcoin, embedded a message in the first block of the Bitcoin blockchain. It was a headline from the Times of London dated January 3, 2009. Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. It was a direct critique of fiat currency and central banking. Bitcoin exists because Nixon destroyed the gold standard. The failure of fiat money created the demand for an alternative. The defenders of Nixon's decision argue that he had no choice. They say that the Bretton Woods system was unsustainable and would have collapsed anyway. They argue that a fixed exchange rate system was incompatible with the realities of a globalized economy. They point out that the world economy grew faster after 1971 than it did under Bretton Woods. All of this is true to some extent, but it misses the larger point. Nixon could have handled the crisis with honesty. He could have worked with other countries to reform the system in a cooperative way. He could have devalued the dollar within the framework of Bretton Woods rather than blowing up the entire system. Instead, he chose to act unilaterally, to break America's promise and to impose the costs of adjustment on the rest of the world. He chose short-term political advantage over long-term stability, and the bill for that decision is still being paid. Every financial crisis since 1971, from the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s to the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to the global financial crisis of 2008, has its roots in the post-Nixon world of fiat currencies and unconstrained debt. Every time a central bank prints trillions of dollars to stimulate the economy, it is following the precedent Nixon set. Every time a government runs a massive deficit without worrying about the consequences, it is relying on the fact that there is no gold standard to impose discipline. The Nixon shock proved that, in the modern world, financial power is more important than military power. Nixon didn't need to invade Europe or Japan to get what he wanted. He just needed to control the printing press. And once he established that the dollar could be created at will, and that the world would still accept it, the United States gained a power that no empire in history had ever possessed. It could finance wars, run deficits, and consume more than it produced, all by simply creating more dollars. As long as the rest of the world needed dollars to buy oil, to trade with each other, and to hold as reserves, America could live beyond its means indefinitely. This is the real legacy of August 15th, 1971. It was the day the United States discovered that it didn't need gold. It just needed the world to believe in the dollar. And for 50 years, that belief has held. But belief is a fragile thing. It can evaporate overnight. And when it does, when the world decides that it no longer wants to hold dollars, when China and Russia and India start trading in their own currencies, when central banks dump their treasury bonds, the house of cards that Nixon built will collapse. The temporary suspension has lasted half a century, but nothing lasts forever.
The inflation that is eating away at savings today, the debt that is crushing future generations, the inequality that is tearing societies apart, all of it can be traced back to that Sunday night in August when a president who wanted to win an election decided to rewrite the rules of money. Nixon got his re-election, the world got permanent instability, and the bill is still being written. If you think there's something we missed or a topic you want us to cover, let's discuss it in the comments. Subscribe now and stay ahead. When history is written, you'll be one of the few who saw it coming.